Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm telling you every single book that I read in the month of March. So if you've been paying attention to this channel, you will know that obviously most of the books in this wrap up are going to be Women's Prize longlist focused. I've been reading the Women's Prize for Fiction longlist and I've been vlogging the whole journey. And obviously that's 16 books long and it's quite a lot of books to get read. So a lot of these are going to be my summed up thoughts for the Women's Prize longlist. Also, we actually have quite a few books in this wrap up from the International Booker Prize shortlist, the International Booker Prize longlist, because I've read a couple of those as well. And obviously there's another, a few just sprinkled in there that I've also managed to read this month. I've read about 16 books this month, and honestly they've been mostly on my Kindle and audiobooks. I only have a few books that I've read actually physically, but we will go through them, I think, in chronological order because that makes most sense in my brain this time. I started off the month reading All Fours by Miranda July, and I actually read this just a day before it was actually announced to be on the Women's Prize long list because I was strongly suspecting from other people's guesses that it would be on the long list, and it was. This one is such a strange book for me to try and sum up and review. Essentially, this is a story about a woman who is kind of having a midlife crisis. She is deciding to drive from her house all the way to New York City because of a throwaway comment that her husband made about basically her inability to do that. But lo and behold, about 20 minutes away from her house, she pulls over into this small town and gets a room at a motel and then stays there for 2 weeks instead of going to New York. I actually really enjoyed most of the beginning of this book because you are following such a strange character. She's very unpredictable in what she's doing, and I felt that I was really engaged with the plot because I didn't know where it was going. Unfortunately for me though, this one didn't end up hitting because I think a lot of it was really relying on kind of a shock factor and a gratuitous kind of descriptions of sex and body stuff and lots of different things that weren't actually that unconventional, but that it was kind of being used as a shock factor within a story itself that is very much a conventional story about a woman who is deciding that perhaps she's not as happy as she thinks. Something I did really enjoy in this book is the exploration of perimenopause and menopause in women, because I don't think that that's discussed very much, and I did feel like it's important to have those stories told, and I did feel like I learned something. But overall this just didn't really hit for me, and it didn't really mesh together very well, especially with kind of the latter half of the book. I thought it kind of fell apart a little bit and my interest was lost. But I actually still ended up giving this book 3 stars because I was for the most part pretty entertained, even if it didn't hit perfectly for me. Next up, I read a book from the International Booker Prize long list, and that is On the Calculation of Volume. This one is a speculative fiction, kind of a sci-fi story, and it's really hard to explain or review because this one was a strange little book. Basically, you are following this woman called Tara, and one day she wakes up and she realizes she's living the same day that she did before. Can you hear her? Come here then. Misa wants to say hi. She wants to say hello. Do you? I'll let you go. Oh no, she's seen my a reflection of my watch on the floor, and she's just going to be chasing that forever now. Anyway, back to talking about this book. This woman is going through kind of a Groundhog Day experience where she's living the same day exactly the same over and over again. I really enjoyed reading this book. It's written in a very strange, dreamlike kind of way about her experience and her mental, because it's written in such a strange and dreamlike way. It doesn't come across as a typical sci-fi or speculative fiction, but it does have that very confusing mystery element of why has she just started living the same day over and over again. And also what I liked about this book is her relationship with her husband and how that was explored, because at the beginning of the story she is going and telling her husband every single time what is happening, and he believes her every single time as well, which I think is really important because it's a trope that I hate when someone tells someone something that someone that they love, something that's happening in their life, that it might be a little bit wacky, and they just flat out don't believe them, and I find it very unrealistic. So I actually really enjoyed the husband and wife relationship in this one. I do think for me it wasn't a completed story though. I am quite I like a plot with an ending, and it doesn't have to have an ending that feels completely satisfying, but it does need to feel satisfying in some way, or at least leave me with a really interesting question. And I think this one just petered off a little bit too much for me. I do think lots of other people would really, really enjoy the way that this one ended, and I think it's more personal preference. But I also think because there's a second volume, the story continues on that one. I was thinking maybe this is why I felt like it was a little bit unfinished, because I'm pretty sure that the second volume picks up exactly where this one leaves off. off. So I actually think that I'm going to read the second volume and kind of treat it as a contained book, like both volumes together, because I did really like how this was written, and I'm still interested to know what's going to happen in the second volume. So this one was hovering around a 3.5 stars for me, but I don't know, like maybe I'd put it up to a 4. Like this one was really interesting. Next up, I read Disappoint Me by Nicola Dinan. I was so excited to read this one because I read Bellies a couple of years ago and absolutely loved it. And I really enjoyed this one too. So in this book, you're following Max, who is pretty successful. They have a poetry collection that they've published. They work as a lawyer, but they're having like not that much luck in their dating life. And then they decide to take on heteronormativity and date someone who's a heteronormative man who their parents would really approve of. But obviously, as they get together, there kind of is realizations that perhaps both of them have more in their past that they are dealing with, and the ripple effects of things that have happened to them are not altogether kind of resolved. I would say overall, I really enjoyed this one. I just really enjoy Nicola Dinan's writing. I like her characters. I like the way that they are funny and a little bit dark and sometimes a little bit mean. And I think that she writes really complicated characters in a really good way. I would say I didn't enjoy this one nearly as much as Bellies, unfortunately, because Bellies, I just feel like the emotional impact of that love story and what those characters were going through just hit me so much harder. I still really enjoyed this read. It was a fun story with characters I could get behind. And in the end, I rated this one 4 stars. Next up, I read my first ever Ali Smith book. I've never read any Ali Smith before, and this is their new release, which is called Glyph. And this one was another one that was so interesting and really hard to talk about. I read so many books this month, so many like literary fiction books that are really unusual and that have really left me thinking. Like long after I finish that last page, I'm like, what am I rating this book? Like, how do I actually feel about it? And this is another one that I feel that exact same way about. So Glyph is a literary dystopian novel, and I personally love dystopian stories, so I did really enjoy this. Basically, in this story and in this world, it's a near future dystopia where technology has advanced even further, but also the surveillance of people is even more intense, and anyone who falls through the cracks basically finds themselves alone and drifting through the world. And you are following 2 children as they find themselves also alone in the world. Their mother is called away for a family emergency, and they find themselves trying to survive in this like very hostile environment. I really enjoyed the young main characters in this, both our narrator and their sister. I think it's really hit and miss when you have like younger protagonists, but I really enjoyed their bond and their relationship with each other and like a lot of the dialogue that they had together. I also think that this makes such an interesting commentary on where we are in our society now and how people can be labelled in different categories and like the levels of surveillance and the political climate. I think that there was so much here. It wasn't a 5-star read for me because I just at times felt a little bit too vague, and a lot of the book you're kind of trying to figure out what's happening, which I do enjoy, but then I do feel like by the end it felt a little bit unfinished. And actually weirdly, this is another one that I've realised is part of a set, and the duology, the second book of this, is coming out at the end of this year, and I think that they're supposed to be read like quite close together as well, which might explain kind of some of my feelings about it. But this one I can highly recommend. It's so interesting, and I really actually think that this is one that I would like to reread when the second book comes out, and it's made me more excited to try Ali Smith's other work as well. So for now, I'm saying that that one is around a 4-star read for me. Next up, I read a book that I just basically picked up in a W.H. Smith and then read in one sitting when I was on the train, and it is Tokyo Express, which is very fun to read while you're also on public transport, because this is a Japanese crime novel and it is all about trains basically. It's written in quite an interesting way because I think it was originally published as like a serial in a newspaper. This is a book that was originally published in the 1930s in Japan, so it's written in quite like short little sharp kind of sections, but I had a good time reading this. I wouldn't like rush to recommend it to everyone, but I did enjoy it while I was reading it. Basically it's about this young couple that is found on this beach, and it looks like they've committed suicide, but there is a couple of clues that are just not quite adding up to why they would commit suicide, and then there's a wider plot to try and figure out if this couple's suicide is related to this government corruption kind of investigation that's ongoing. And you're following a couple of different investigators as they're trying to piece together this crime. It was pretty fun. I wouldn't say it was life-changing in any way, but it's I think my first like Japanese crime fiction that I've ever read, so it was enjoyable for that. But this is like going to be hovering around like a 3 stars for me, maybe like a 2.5. I wasn't like kind of absolutely gasping or shocked by any of the reveals, but it was a fun read still. Unfortunately, next up we have the worst book that I read this month, and I'm so shocked. I can't believe that this is the worst book that I read this month, especially because last month I read like most of this author's other works and loved them. But unfortunately, I read Say You'll Remember Me by Abby Jimenez, and I hated it. I don't know where it went so wrong. This one felt so different in like almost every way to the other Abby Jimenez's books. Like some of the bones were there, but it felt like an unfinished draft compared to her other books. This is obviously a contemporary romance story. And in this book, you're following a vet and a woman who comes in with a very unwell kitten, and that's how they first originally meet. They get off on the wrong foot, but then eventually they go on one beautiful date that just lasts all night, and they are basically falling in love at first sight on this most magical day ever. But then the next day, she is moving across the country and they will never see each other again. Already, like, alarm bells should have been going for me, because I don't love the insta-love trope, and I don't love like the long distance kind of thing, because so much of what this book is it relies on this insta love, this insta connection that they've both had, and the fact that they will do anything to be together when they have had one date. So already that's like not gelling well with me. But honestly, a lot of just the dialogue in this really cringed me out. I didn't see any chemistry between the main characters. It's got the typical grumpy sunshine trope, but the guy is the grumpy one, and I just thought he had no personality, and he was just quite rude as well. Also, everything, he was just referenced basically as looking like Rysand from the Sarah J Maas series, and I just literally was cringing every time that was mentioned. Basically, the reason they can't get together as well is because he's set up his vet clinic and she is looking after her mum, who is suffering from dementia that is like rapidly progressing. I think both of their backstories just felt really like they didn't make much sense. Like her whole family dynamic of every single one of her like siblings and the dad also being there, and her grandma also all moving into the same house to look after their mum who has dementia, and they didn't want to get a full-time carer or any kind of other financial help. Like a lot of the way that was set up didn't feel like it made any sense to me, and it felt like very like they were all being martyrs and like just deciding that their own lives were over and like moving back home, and it just really didn't make sense. And then also his whole vet clinic thing, the fact that he managed to open up this vet clinic and then wanted to just basically close it down and like move across this like the other side of the country for her as well. Like, no, obviously he can't do it, but obviously he's in love, and like it felt very, very repetitive as well. It was like, oh, one of them goes to fly to see the other one, they have a beautiful magical date, and then they're apart again, and they go, oh my god, like, but why can't we be together, and just forget about me, and like, no, I can't forget about you, I'm gonna come and see you, and then they come and see it, just like over and over and over again. It was really boring. It was bad. I didn't like the chemistry. I didn't like the characters. I didn't even really like that. Like usually with an Abby Jimenez book, there is something as well that is like very real life that they add in, that is just like something that's hard hitting, something that you're dealing with, like there's like kind of something like basically horrible is happening to someone. But in this one, I felt like that was really clumsily introduced as well, and I just didn't buy any of it. And like a lot of it was just used for like a shock factor or an emotional kind of punch, when it didn't feel like well earned in any way. I was just so disappointed with this one. Honestly, it's like 1 star, like 1.5 maybe, but probably just 1. And it's made me really honestly rethink if I want to try out Abby Jimenez's other books as well, because I was like loving their books before this. They were just like, all of them were like 4 or 5 stars for me, and this one was so bad. But I'm honestly the exception to the rule, because everyone else is giving this like 5 stars and like they're absolutely eating it up and loving it. So take my review with a pinch of salt perhaps. Next up, this is when I started reading the Women's Prize long list. Obviously I read all 4s, which is on the long list, but then this one is the next one that I intentionally read after the long list came out, and that is The Persians. And unfortunately, this one also did not work for me. This is a book about a family. You're following kind of 3 generations of women in the same family, and their family was kind of forced to flee from Iran or Persia in 1979, and they moved to America. And you're now following 3 different generations and kind of jumping back in the timeline as well. In the current timeline, one of the characters is basically trying her best to like make her family name important again, because they used to be a really big name in Persia, in Iran, and in America no one cares about who they are. And so it's kind of, I think, trying to make a commentary on these like big names and like what they actually rely on is people caring about them. But this is basically just a story about an incredibly rich, privileged family who are all terrible people, which I could enjoy if it was more of like the Crazy Rich Asians kind of vibe, where you're just kind of like looking into their life and going, oh my god, this is like so terrible. But because this also was trying to make you feel quite sorry for them, it just really didn't work. Because why do I care if they have like a family name that means something, or like about their family history, if they genuinely don't do anything now and they're incredibly naive? That was like the biggest thing for this, is like so many of the characters were so naive in every single generation. I think I would have just much more enjoyed a story based in Iran or Persia in the 1970s, and like having much more of a focus on the political and the historical aspect of this story, because everything else really fell flat and I did not enjoy it, unfortunately. And that is such a shame, because I really love this cover of this book as well. So this was a 2-star read for me in the end. Next up for the Women's Prize long list, I read The Artist, which is a historical fiction novel, and it's got a romance subplot as well. This one I think didn't quite work for me either. This I'm giving a 3 out of 5 stars. In this story, you're following a young journalist who really admires this very reclusive artist and sends him a letter asking if he can come and interview him, and then gets an invitation. And when he turns up, he realizes that the artist has no idea why he's there, but he does get the opportunity to ask to be a model for this artist, and then he gets access to this house and this reclusive artist, and also begins to have a friendship with the artist's niece, who basically works as his secretary and maid and carer and does everything around the house for this artist. Very early on, you know how this story is going to go, and in fact you have a flashback as one of the first kind of paragraphs in this book, and it tells you kind of what's going to happen. So then later on, when things are revealed, it doesn't have any kind of emotional punch or hit, because it's very obvious what's going to happen. And also, even if you didn't understand from that first paragraph of what's going to happen, it's heavily hinted of what's going to happen. So the plot, I would say, was quite lacking, and then also the romantic subplot didn't quite work for me either. I did like one of our main characters, which is the niece, Etty, and her struggle to kind of be seen in this world where she is like just kind of relegated constantly to the sidelines of being this helper to this great man and this great artist. I've read many books like that before, and I didn't feel it was adding anything particularly fresh or new or interesting about the nature of art and the artist or anything like that. One thing for this book though, I would say, is I really did enjoy the writing and the setting of this book. It's very visual, and that is just something that is definitely done well, because this is a book all about art, and I think that you could do this in such a bad way as well, because obviously art is so visual, but some of this writing is really evocative. It's very beautiful, it's very focused on the nature and the landscape and the food, and you can actually really visualize this happening. So I will give it extra points for that, but unfortunately ended up being about 3 stars for me. Next up, we have better luck with the next book, which is The Dream Hotel. This is one also on the Women's Prize long list, and I really enjoyed this one. So this is another dystopian, and obviously I already do really enjoy a dystopian book, and this is basically set in a near future where the surveillance and data mining and things like that have really amped up even more than they already are. In this book, you're following a woman, and she is on her way back home to see her husband. She gets stopped at the airport and then detained because something in this algorithm has decided that she is at risk of hurting her husband. So she has to come and then be observed for 3 weeks, and then they will release her. But as soon as she is detained in this retention center, which is not a prison but looks very much like a prison, she realizes that it's going to be actually probably a lot longer than 3 weeks. I think that this book was so successful for me because it just had a very clear idea of what it wanted to get across, and it didn't stray from that. It was really propulsive with the plot. I felt tense while I was reading it. I basically read the whole thing in one day, and it stuck really close to the theme, and it feels like it is so realistic and could genuinely start happening to us, despite the kind of like more fantastical elements of the story. It touches on the surveillance state and like how our data is being used, and capitalism and the prison system as well, and the inherent like misogyny and racism that is built into algorithms in general. I really liked and backed our main character as Sarah. I thought that she really went on a journey throughout this, and then she was an active like participant in this story. This didn't quite hit the 5-star mark for me, just because I feel like there was some weaknesses maybe in the ending. It could have hit a little bit harder, but overall thoroughly enjoyed this book. I really do recommend it, especially if you like speculative fiction and dystopian fiction. I think that you'll really enjoy this one, and I'm just really happy to see this on the long list as well, because I love to see some genre fiction on there as well. Which then takes me to the next book that is also genre fiction that was on the long list and didn't work for me at all in the end, unfortunately, and that is The Ministry of Time. This book, people have a difficulty explaining what it is because it could be so many different things, and that's, I think, part of my issue with the book is it feels like a huge mashup of many different things, and it doesn't successfully do any of them. It's a sci-fi, it's a romance, it's a thriller, it occasionally tries to be like a literary commentary. In this book, time travel has been invented and immediately used by the government to kidnap people from time. There's 5 different people who are known in history to be about to die, and they are kidnapped and taken through time to our time and basically kind of spied on. If you're expecting any kind of explanation for the sci-fi elements of this story, then it basically says at the very beginning of this, don't worry about it, which does annoy me because I like worrying about it. I want to know the logic and I want to know the reasons and I want things to make sense. This doesn't make any sense. If you can put that aside, then it begins as kind of a slice of life romance story between our Bridge character, who is in the current time and working to basically spy and help the person from the past kind of acclimatize to our time, while also spying on them for the agency. The story at the beginning, I was kind of just going along with because, like I said, it's this kind of like budding romance slice of life story. There's lots of jokes about kind of disconnect between the 2 main characters. But then this book also occasionally tries to be a commentary on racism and microaggressions and British imperialism, and then sometimes climate change. It throws in a lot of different things and doesn't discuss them all very deeply at all. And then also tries to have a commentary on language as well, because our main character is a linguist. And then at the end of the book, it becomes a thriller basically that tries to like kind of sum up everything that's going on and like have this like very exciting action sequence that also doesn't work at all because it doesn't make any sense. It just feels very awkwardly put together, and I think one of the reasons is I read after the fact is that this was basically, I think, an amalgamation between the author's fan fiction, because there is a big fandom for the main character is Commander Gore, and he went on a Arctic exhibition and everyone died on this exhibition, and this is like quite a well-known historical event and has like quite a lot of like a fandom around it, and some people write fan fiction about it. This book has come out of fan fiction from that fandom, which is quite obviously mentioned. Like Tumblr is mentioned in this book as well, which is where like lots of these fandoms kind of exist, and the way that the romance came about seemed like it was fan fiction as well. But I wouldn't be upset if it was a romance fan fiction, that was what the story was, but it also felt like a mishmash of another book as well, which the author has said that they had another character from a different story and they basically dropped her into this other story, and that's exactly how it felt, and it didn't work at all. I didn't like either of the characters. I go into this a lot more in my vlog where I was reading this book, but I didn't like either of the characters at all. It didn't make any sense where it was going, and I also didn't love the humour of it. I don't love that type of humour where it's like, oh, like I've accidentally said something racist and it's a slur and I didn't realise, and like that felt a lot of what the humour was. It felt very strange. So that was a 2-star read from me, unfortunately. But next up we have the best book of the month so far, and this one I'm rounding up to a 5-star read, and that is Amma. This is also on the Women's Prize long list, and this is one of those books that I'm just so pleased exists and was on the list, because I would not have read this if I had just seen it or like read the back. And also this is from a small press, so I probably wouldn't have come across this anyway if it hadn't been nominated. This is a beautiful story all about 3 different women in the same family. So many reasons why it wouldn't be a book that works for me, because I don't usually love multi-generational stories. I don't love stories focused on trauma. I don't love stories that jump around in timelines, and that is all within this book, but it is done in such an expertly like done way. It's really beautiful. This story starts off in the 1950s in Singapore with a 10-year-old girl who has a very traumatic event happen to her, and then you are jumping around in time and following her daughter, and then her daughter's daughter, so her granddaughter, and you're seeing the ripple effects of this traumatic event and what it has done to their family. I thought the writing was really beautiful. I loved each of the characters, and that is so rare for me for a multi-generational story, to really feel very deeply for all of the characters and feel like they all are growing as well. The timeline jumping around was done in such a beautiful way. It wasn't done purely for like kind of shock factor. I feel like sometimes timeline jumps are done just to keep you reading because of like, you know, you're about to find something out and then the timeline jumps and then like you have to kind of come back to it and it keeps you reading. It's like a technique that I don't love. In this, it was just woven together so beautifully that just made you feel so deeply for these characters. I can just highly recommend this one. I can't say much even about it because it's not the most plot heavy book either, but I just loved it. I felt so much for these women in this story and I was bawling by the end of it. And if any book can make me cry, it's going to be a 5-star read for me. So that is Amma. Next up, we have not a Woman's Prize long listed book, but just one that I randomly read. I got it from my library and it was going to be due to be returned, so I quickly read it because it's not too long, and it is I Will Crash. This is a story about a woman, and one day her brother, who she's estranged from, shows up on her door and she closes the door on him and does not speak to him, and then a couple of weeks later she finds out he has died. So it is her process going through the grief of what's happened and losing her brother, but also reliving a lot of what happened in her childhood and the reasons why she closed the door on him. The writing was really beautiful. I thought it was explored in a very like nuanced way, but ultimately I don't know whether it's because I've just read so much literary fiction recently and lots of things that are written in a slightly more unusual way, that this one, like, I really liked it, but I can't say anything much more about it. It's a very introspective book. It's focusing on family dynamic, and it's written in a very interesting way. Like, physically on the page, there's lots of kind of gaps as well with some of the writing. Overall, though, I really enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 stars. I would definitely recommend it. It explores things in a very careful way. It didn't make me cry. It didn't hit me that emotionally, but I did really enjoy reading it. Next up, we have another one on the International Booker Prize long list, and that is Small Boat. This one was another one that is so interesting. I'm really glad I read it. This is a story all about a real event that happened with a dinghy that was carrying 40 people from France across the channel to the UK, and the dinghy sank into the channel and only 2 people survived. So this is a real event that happens, and in this fictionalized story you're following the woman who was taking calls from the migrants in this dinghy asking for help, because basically what happened is that the French authorities told the migrants in the boat that they were actually in British waters when they weren't, and that they had to call the British for help instead. And basically there is like a question of what actually happened and why she said what she did. Did she truly believe that? Was she actually responsible for the death of these people? And so you're following inside her head, and it's a very strange place to be, and the way that she is kind of going round in circles and talking about this issue of responsibility and her own responsibility. This was a really difficult read because not only being inside this woman's mind was a very difficult place to be, but also it's intercut with chapters from the migrants on the boat, and it just it begs you to ask the question of like, how much are you really doing, or are you a bystander as well? And I think it's a very, very powerful commentary on that effect. So I rated this 4 out of 5 stars. I think it was just a little bit too short as well, and I think I would have enjoyed it to be even longer. But overall, I definitely recommend. And then the next 3 books that I want to briefly mention in my wrap up, but I'm going to be doing a vlog where I talk about these in much more detail, so I will just briefly mention them. I read Nesting and Fundamentally, and also finally Crooked Seeds. So these will all be in my upcoming Women's Prize vlog, where I will go into detail about my thoughts on these books. So I'm not going to go into it now. Also, I feel like I've already been talking for so long in this long video because I did read 16 books this month, which feels crazy, but it's actually working out to be about average lately of how many books I read. As a little spoiler for my vlog, I would say out of those 3 books currently, my favourite is Nesting. But you're gonna have to wait for the vlog to see my full thoughts and feelings as I read them. This is just me advertising my vlogs. Also, someone suggested in a recent video that I do some videos on the International Booker Prize list. So I think what I'll do is actually maybe read some of the shortlist and do another vlog or do some roundup videos of that. So let me know if you'd be interested in seeing that, because I think that would be kind of fun to do. And hopefully by the time that shortlist comes out, I will have read most of the books from the Women's Prize longlist, because otherwise I can't be overlapping again. It's too many books to read in too short of a time. Before I sign off, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon. Thank you so much for signing up to my Patreon. You are my favorite people in the world. And if you want to become one of my favorite people in the world, then the link to my Patreon is always in the description. There is exclusive videos over on there. There is voting rights for the book club, which, by the way, if you're eagle-eyed, you will have noticed that I haven't actually included the book club book in this monthly roundup because I'm only 50% through the book and I feel really bad about it. I think this is actually the first time I've not finished the book club book in the month and I feel so bad about it, but I've been just pushing myself to read as many of the Women's Prize ones as I can, and I'm only 50% through. If you're in the book club, we are doing Shadow of the Banyan this month, and next month we're actually choosing a book from Mozambique, and I will let you click in the link in the description to go over to Fable to see which book we've chosen as well for the month of April. I think that is all from me today, so thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you so much for my Patreons for helping make this video happen. Make sure to like this video and subscribe if you're not already, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye!